Welcome to this session on an introduction to GitHub Actions. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Richard Fennell. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Black Marble. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Developer Technologies. In that, I spend most of my time looking at the build and release side of Azure DevOps, so I found GitHub Actions a particularly interesting area to have a look at. So, what are we going to look at in this session? We're going to look at three major areas. What did we do for continuous integration and continuous delivery for GitHub in the past? What actually are GitHub Actions? And finally, can I write my own actions? Because as soon as you give anybody a build system, they want to extend it. And for me particularly, I've already invested time in Azure DevOps pipeline extensions, and I wondered if I could make use of any of those in GitHub Actions. And we'll be looking at what I learned from that as we carry on. So firstly, what do we used to do? If you were using GitHub in the past, GitHub provides excellent source control. It provides a great way of doing issue tracking, but it didn't provide any mechanism for automated build or delivery. So you had to bring something else to the party. And you could bring pretty much anything you fancied. Any of the technologies that are out there for build and release probably had a connector to GitHub. And if they didn't, well, it was just Git anyway, so you could just connect however you wanted to. So we had TeamCity, Jenkins, Bamboo, Azure pipelines. As I said, I use a lot of Azure DevOps pipelines, so that's how I made my connections. So all of my Azure DevOps pipeline tasks are stored up in GitHub, but I build them using Azure DevOps pipelines. As you can see here, a build for my Wiki Updater extension. This build shows the new way of doing it using YAML. Historically, there used to be a graphical way of doing all your builds in here, but this isn't a session about Azure DevOps pipelines. So, I'm going to skip over that. I also did releases with Azure DevOps pipelines. And that actually shows the graphical interface for this, allowed me to take my builds and deploy them out to environments for various testing and release. So I had a CI solution, the build, and a CD solution, both done with Azure DevOps pipelines. This is the type of thing I want to be able to do with any system. So, what are GitHub Actions? How do they help? What do they bring to the game? Well, anybody who's looked at Azure pipelines, Azure DevOps pipelines, will notice there's a certain sort of genetic similarity with GitHub Actions. Microsoft purchased GitHub, well over probably 2 years ago now, and we've slowly seen greater collaboration between the two separate dev teams to bring things forwards. And we can see that GitHub Actions have taken quite a few concepts, at least, from Azure DevOps pipelines. So we have the ability to build on a whole variety of hosts: Linux, Mac, Windows, and you can also use containers as your build host. We also get the concept of any language, so that it doesn't really matter what you're building. The build boxes, as long as the build boxes have the appropriate compilers installed upon them, are able to build your product. You know, this isn't a build box just for Java. This isn't a build box just for C#. They'll build anything as long as you can get the appropriate tools on there. And many of the tools are already there for you to get you going. What you also get that you don't see with Azure DevOps pipelines is this concept of matrix builds. You can trigger multiple builds all at the same time, all off in parallel. Now, you do get something similar with Azure DevOps pipelines, but here the new way of doing it, the syntax is far more straightforward than the old graphical way of building builds inside Azure DevOps pipelines. So we've got any platform, any language, and a way to very easily do parallel builds on different platforms. So, what else do you get when it's running? Well, we get live logs. So as a build's running along, you can actually see what's happening at each point. We have an ability to store secrets. So if you need to inject secrets into your build, such as certificates or passwords or anything along those lines, those can be stored securely inside your GitHub repo. and injected into build as and when needed. And we also get the ability to start to push out to testing. And this is very much leveraged via Docker. So you can actually start to provision out environments to do whatever testing you wish to do, assuming you have an appropriate Docker container. Then we come to the most important one for many people. What's it cost? Well, the simple answer is if you're working on a public repo on OSS projects, it's free. You're getting free build minutes on build boxes. You don't have to worry about it. So the key advantage here with all of those other solutions that we had that you could have historically used for GitHub CI/CD, you had to stand something else up. And that might have meant you had to spin up a machine in Azure or spin up a machine physically in your office or some other scenario, or commission some system using a cloud-based build service. Now you don't have to do anything. Everything's already been provisioned for you. You don't have to worry about it. If you do want to use this with private repos, you basically pay on a per minutes per month system. Now, dependent on the GitHub license that you have, you do get some build minutes, and then you basically buy more at the rates that you can see on there. It's interesting to note that self-hosted build agents, something I've always found really useful when debugging my own Azure DevOps tasks, are on their way. So you will be able to provision a box that's inside your corporate firewall that talks out to GitHub and allows you to still do a build. And that can be not so important for build, but can be vital for some deployment scenarios where you need to deploy something behind a firewall and you need to place an agent that can do that piece of work. So, enough of me talking. Let's have a quick look at a first workflow. So here we have a very simple TypeScript application. If we go in and have a quick look at the source, we can see we have a traditional hello world. Doesn't really do very much. But what we'd like to do is actually put in an action in here to actually build this. So to do that, we go and click on Actions. And we get up the wizard that sort of says, you don't have any actions at the moment. What would you like to do? Now, I can obviously skip over on the right and just start building my workflow from scratch. But it also gives me some templates to get me going. So I can pick my template because I happen to know that my application needs Node. And it's created me a workflow. Now, you can see it's going to drop it into the folder GitHub Workflows Node.js. And note, I can have as many workflows in here as I want. This one is a default CI workflow, which means anytime somebody pushes to the repo, it will cause this build to be triggered. It's going to then run a job. We have one job in here, which is the build job, and we've told it to run on Ubuntu, but it's going to run it on 3 different versions of Node. Now, obviously, I can reconfigure those. I then have the steps that I'm going to run on my build. So I'm going to check out some code. I'm going to set up the versions of Node that I require. I'm then going to use npm to trigger an install, a build, and then to run any tests I've got. And I've got a couple of tests in here just to make sure that the thing works. And that's it. Now, what I would quite like to do is make this a matrix build. So what I could do is change my run strategy, and I'm just nicking a code sample from the right over here, to say instead of running specifically on Ubuntu, I want to run on everything I've defined in this strategy. So I still want to use the 3 different versions of Node, but I'd also like to try running it on Ubuntu, Windows, and on Mac. So that's my build that I'd like to start with, and I can just commit it. Obviously, you should really give good commit messages, but for a quick demo, this will do. and it's now just saved that file for me. If I go back and look on my actions now, we can see that the build is triggered, because the build triggers because there's a push every time. And it happens, if I edit the build, it will run the new version of the build script. And this can be really useful if you set the values so it triggers on pull requests and the like. If I go and click into this, I should be able to see my build running. So we can see it's expanded out the matrix and given me my builds that it's got to run against. They're all running in parallel. They'll all run at different speeds dependent on availability of those types of build boxes. And we can see the live logging going on. So if I click back on a step that's completed, we get the logging of what it managed to do. We can see the logging is continuing to appear. And as we can see, build's running through, so it's happily finished on Ubuntu latest using Node 8. So the Ubuntu box is finished and the others are carrying on. So that's going quite well. So we can see here that we're actually getting some logging information. But what happens if we wanted to see a bit more logging information? Many of the actions that are in here, actually, they log out more information than is initially shown. And so what we can do is throw this into a debugging model so it will show us more information. Now this is done by adding a secret. So this is a good example of showing how any secret would be added. Now, slightly counterintuitively, you might think that you'd add it somewhere to do with the actions, but what you actually do is you go into the settings for the repo, because this setting is repo wide. You go into secrets and you add a new secret. And the secret that you need to add is, I've already got it here, actions step debug, and you just have to set the value true. So what that should do is, when we next run a build, we should see a lot more logging going on in our build. So if we flip over to a local cloned copy of that repo, and I just quickly go into source control and I do a pull, just to pull down anything that's in there, we can now see that we've got our YAML based build process. Now if I want to edit my build process here as opposed to into the browser, that's fine. The other key thing to note is this build, because it's in source control, we've got every version of it. So if you need to go back and see how the product was built 6 months ago and you've radically changed your build process, it's not a problem. You can always roll back, get the appropriate commit, and you've got the builds at that point in time. So let's actually go and do something to actually break this. So if we go and have a look in our looking in the wrong place. In my test folder, there's a test. Let's go and break our test. So I'm going to do something stupid. I'm going to break that test. I will break the test. I'll push that up to the server. If we now go back and look at our actions, we should, in a moment, see the new, there we are, the new commit is going through. We'll just wait for the workflows to start, pulling a suitable resource, we can see, and instantly we see loads of purple all over the screen because I've switched on debugging. So again, if you're just using a task, sorry, an action, force a habit. If you're using an action, you probably don't need debugging on most of the time. But if you're developing them, switching on debugging and adding extra levels of logging can be a really useful thing to do. You can see it's managed to get the code. It's now running npm. It's happily coming along. It's trying to do the build. It's now trying to run a test. And we should see a failed test. And there we are. It's actually showing us on the screen where our fault is. 1 plus 1 is not equal to 3. So, just for completeness, before I go back, I will go and fix that. So I'll just go and put that back. Put in a quick message. Commit that. And push that up. And that will actually go off and trigger another build that will validate. Now, important thing to realise here, I'm using this as CI/CD. That the build will run every time I commit anything to the repo. You might choose to change the rules in the build so that it runs as on a PR, which is often a better way of improving code quality. So it's part of your gatekeeper process. So whenever you try and complete a PR, it triggers the build to validate the build and blocks the PR if the code doesn't pass through that gate. So that's a basic use of the actions. If we drop back into slides, so we've had a look at our first action. I mentioned that it's extensible, and it's extensible not just from stuff that's been written by GitHub, it's community extensible. So if you go into the GitHub marketplace and filter on actions, you'll see an ever-growing number of actions starting to appear. Now, some of these have been produced by GitHub, some by other third-party software vendors, and some just by the community. Some to do all sorts of interesting and wondrous things, and some of them to say things with a cow. You're going to find the normal wide selection and quality of actions in here that do different things for different purposes. And you can add your own special features, your actions, to that list. So, my thought was, well, I've got loads of custom Azure DevOps pipeline tasks. Can I use any of these? Seemed a sensible question. And so I did a bit of investigation. So, what makes a good candidate for a GitHub action? Well, the first one, it needs to be written in Node.js. Now, this isn't strictly true. GitHub actions are written in Node.js or their Docker containers. So if you've got something that isn't Node.js, but you can put it in a Docker container, you can still use it. Now, I've not investigated that route to any great extent thus far. So all of my stuff's been focused on Node.js. So most of the rest of this session focuses on Node.js. But don't rule out Docker. Docker is a way to do something that isn't Node. You can't make use of Azure DevOps specific APIs. It sort of stands to reason. If my task calls something that's specific to Azure DevOps, there's no point trying to port that over to GitHub Actions because the API won't be there. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't APIs that give you something similar. So I've got some tasks that build release notes. Now, they're very specific to the way Azure DevOps works. But what I could do is I could port that broad logic, or at least the concept, over to GitHub Actions, but I'd have to make calls that get stuff out of GitHub issues. Now, the chances are starting from scratch again would probably be easier than trying to port, just because, it's apples and oranges. I've got two completely different APIs. The chances are nothing aligns. I might as well start again. But that might not necessarily be true with a task that you've got. So, I've not focused on that. It must do something useful in GitHub. Now, again, I've got a whole pile of tasks that apply version numbers to files. Now, that should be useful on any platform, but the way they were written took the version number from the build number. Now, GitHub Actions don't have a build number. They're all focused around building branches, building commits. So their build number, or the closest equivalent, as I can see, is effectively a commit ID. or a branch or something like that. That's not a 1.2.3 build number. So you've got to think about, what do I have to do to make my task, even though the concept is applicable, to work on GitHub Actions. So what did I do to move some actions over? Well, the first thing I did was I created a new empty GitHub repo for my new action. Now, actions live in repos. One action per repo. And there's a very nice little auto generator that will scaffold out a repo for you. So I used that first. I then copied my task code into the repo, effectively file by file. So I took the contents of my tasks main.js file or .ts file and put it into the main.ts file in the repo. I then moved over any libraries that I had. And whilst doing that, I removed any code that wasn't needed. So if I was doing something like trying to extract a version number from a build number, I threw away that because I didn't need to do that. I needed to be able to pass in a version number just as a string. So I removed any code that wasn't required. I swapped all of my references from the Azure DevOps task library to the Actions library. And that was as simple as, and those are all the ones that deal with logging and getting variables and those sorts of things. But they were basically line for line swaps, change from Azure DevOps.log to GitHub Actions.log, effectively. So those are quick and easy changes. A big change that I made was I had historically, for all of my node-based tasks on Azure DevOps, used Mocha and Chai for testing. The scaffolded sample used Jest as a testing framework, so I made the call to port all of my tests over to Jest from Mocha and Chai. Now that actually caused me a few issues due to the way serialization and parallelization of tasks worked. I had to do a little bit of work just to tidy a few things up there, but I decided it was more advantageous, especially if I was going to push this stuff out into the community, to use the standardized testing framework rather than introduce something different for other people, the people that wouldn't be used to. And also, I added to the build process the act of running JS lint. So I now cannot get my project to build unless it doesn't show any linting errors. This is something I've always done with my Node stuff. I find it tends to increase my code quality because I don't do anything stupid, or at least greatly reduce the number of stupid things I do. So I think that's advantageous to add, but you may not agree because it can be a bit picky at times. I then finally updated the actions manifest with the details required to expose any variables that I was required for my actions. So this is not quite a like-for-like port between the two types of manifest, but generally the same, because I was exposing pretty much the same variables. So I built this and I wanted to release it. I wanted to use it. What did I do? Well, this is where it gets interesting. Unlike Azure DevOps pipelines, where you build a package and publish it to the marketplace, whether publicly or privately, the way GitHub Actions work is they're just a repo and you look on a specific branch to get the code that's current. So what you have to do is you create a releases branch. You start with a V1 branch. You have to commit into that any dependencies. So effectively everything that's in the node modules folder has to be pushed into that branch, so it's actually committed into the repo. You remove anything that's not required for it's only dev and not runtime. You commit all of that in and you push that up onto your release branch, and that's now available for you to use. Now, this can all get a little bit interesting, but this is the sort of the branching strategy that's recommended. You start off with your main branch, you do a bit of dev. When you're ready to do the release, you create a release branch. From there, you're able to test that. You can then do any bug fixes that you need to do, a few more bug fixes. When you're ready to do a formal release, you make sure your release branch is up to date with anything that you've changed on the master branch. And the key thing is you add some tags to it. And then if you do some more bug fixes later, you can move along and you can move your tags to point to the current version that you wish to use. What that means is there's a number of ways that you can use your action in a workflow. So the first one is you can refer to the Git repo, so by the name of the account, then the repo name, and then give it a specific commit ID as the version that you want to run. Not the most user-friendly way of working, but might be useful for testing. You can refer to it by looking for a tag, the v10. This is the branch that points to the v10. Or you can actually put a specific branch name into them. All of those are perfectly valid ways of testing, though the middle one, the v10, would be the one you'd normally use. And then when version 2 comes out, you'd have a tag that points to the v2 branch, etc, etc, etc. But if you want to write an action that no one else is going to want to use, no way will anybody else want to use it, or for some reason you don't want anybody else to use it, you can just place it inside the repo where it's required. And you just stick it in any folder you feel like inside the repo, so you just use a relative path to find it. So you do have that option, though it's fair to say all of the documentation does point you very much down the custom repo per action sort of model. So the final thing to do is I've created my action in a repo. The repo's public. So I can come along and I'd like to advertise the fact that that exists. Now there's nothing stopping anybody using that because it's public anyway, but how would they find it? So what we want to do is put it into the GitHub marketplace. So what we do for that is we go into GitHub, we go into the repo where the action lives and we create a new draft release. We select the option in there, publish to marketplace. We fix any errors that it tells us about. That's normally you've messed up the manifest. You do that by checking in or editing, checking in any missing files or editing files that you've got wrong, pushing them onto the branch. You choose what categories the action belongs to. Is it a utility? Is it build? Is it test? That sort of thing. You pick the tag that points to the current public release. And then you click Publish Release, and that's it. And once you've done that, your action should appear in the marketplace for anybody else to find. So, let's have a look at a custom action now. So, the first thing to have a look at is how would I start? So, if I wanted to start a new TypeScript action, a Node TypeScript-based action, I can come into this repo, the actions TypeScript action, and hit the use template, and it'll come up and say, where do you want to put it? Is it public or private? Give it a name, and it will go off and create me an empty scaffolded repo. So that's absolutely fine. That's exactly what I want. And that's what I did to create this repo. So I went off and it created me my JSON file versioner repo. It created a test folder, a docs folder, lib, source, all of these things, and I basically got my code into it. So I'm just going to hop over to VS Code and have a look at it from there. So we can see in here that we have a standard workflow, an action workflow is already in here, and this one's set to fire whenever we push code or do a pull request. We can see that I haven't done anything in here other than it just runs the npm tests exactly as we saw on our other one. I have then added into here my code. So the main.ts is my main entry point, and you can see I've added in my core.debugging to give me some debugging information. and you can see basically all I do is I deal with getting my various variables out, and I pass them into a library.ts file that I had. And this TS file had virtually no changes at all from the version that was on Azure DevOps Pipelines, because this doesn't really understand anything about the platform it's on other than how to do logging. So the only reason that the Actions core requirement is in there is to give me access to the debugger, so I can actually fire out messages to the debug console. So that came over straight. The main piece of work that I did was rewriting all of my tests so that they just run using Jest. But other than that, there wasn't any major change to them. They still basically take test files, do a transform, and then check the values in the resultant files. The one thing I did do, I mentioned, was that in the package.json, I added in that I wanted to run JSLint on all of my .ts files. So that is a change from the default template. So I'd moved files over, I'd tidied them up, I did very little else. The only other major things that I did was update the manifest for the build, which is the action.yaml, and this just describes all of the various variables that are required and what it's going to run on. And I also updated my license file to say how my product was licensed, and there's a readme file which is what will appear in the marketplace. Now, it is a good idea here for the readme file. I forgot this the first time round, to put in some usage information, so if anybody comes and has a look at it, it's showing them a little code snippet of how to use the task. So what I can do is that if I flip back into the Git repo from here, we can see that every time I've updated the code, we've had builds run, including the build, the validation, that runs my JSLint, that runs my tests, does everything in there, so I know I'm getting my code quality. If I go back to code and have a quick look on releases, we can see I've had 2 releases of this, but if I go and click on this release and click edit for the current run, we can see that these are the validation questions. So I said we have to tick the box, publish this action to the GitHub Marketplace, and then it's validated my action.yaml, that it's got all the appropriate things in it. It's validated my readme. It's allowed me to pick what categories I have. You have to have a primary category, you don't have to have a secondary, and I can choose which tag is currently released as version 1. Now I can continue to increment version 1 by just moving that tag along to point at different commits on the release branch. When I come to doing a version 2, I'd create a brand new release in here, so version 1 is still available, but so is version 2. So finally, the act of publishing this release actually bobs it into the marketplace, and we can see here my task sitting in the marketplace. So we can see my readme file with my little usage sample, and I'll take that. It gives you an example on how to use the latest up here, but this doesn't actually provide you with all of the parameters that you might want. So I'll stick with that one. And if we now drop back into my actions, my very first sample that we had, if I wanted to add in my step, I can put that in, and I'd like to version the files before I do the build. So we put that in. So we've added in my action. We told it what path we're going to look for. We want the version that we want to inject. We're going to look for all the .json files, and we want it to do recursion. So if I save that, we can see that I've added an action to it. I push that up to the server, and if we go back and have a look on the first action, We can see it starting all of our various builds. And we can see there it pulled down my action, it's running the first step, and there we can see it ran my versioner. I've got all of my rich debugging to help me as a developer work out what's going on, and we can see at the bottom that it did actually version some files that it found as it went along. So that debugging is particularly useful to you during development, and especially if you've got a user who's trying to use one of your actions and they're having problems, you can tell them to flip it into debug mode and give a more rich form of debugging. So, back to the slides. So, that is a very quick look at GitHub Actions. It's showing how you can make use of them yourself, and also how you can do a very quick move over and get your work into them. So, what do we know from doing this? Well, GitHub Actions, they're a new alternative for CI/CD for GitHub. And the key point is, you now don't have to leave GitHub to do your build process, and you don't have to provision any new special resources. It's all there available for you. Whether you're going to make use of stuff that's just written in Node, or you need to provision out Docker environments, it's all available to you. Whether that be Mac, Linux or Windows, and pretty much any language you choose to build. It's free for open source, and it's pay per minute for private repos. But if you do have commercially licensed versions for GitHub, you do get some build minutes built in there, which may well be enough for you to do stuff. They're not as rich as Azure DevOps pipelines as yet, or as rich as other build and release tools. They're young, they're still in a beta phase, but functionality is growing in them as we go on. The functionality is also being enhanced by the simple fact that they're community driven for actions being released. So that's an important area. So we're going to see stuff continually coming along for them. So they'll continue a good area to look for, especially for your open source projects. Because you don't have to provision anything special. We keep coming back to that. All of the other systems involved you linking to something external. This gives you a mechanism to do it internally. So there's a rich app community on the GitHub community, where there's discussion, very active discussions over features, what's coming along, and people can give you assistance. And also there's documentation that is not bad at all. To walk through and get you moving, irrespective of whether you're aiming to do stuff in Node or with Docker. And with that, thank you for listening and watching this video. It was recorded before a live studio audience at the Black Marble offices up in Yorkshire. So my apologies for any little glitches that we had whilst that was going on. But if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Twitter's probably your best option. And thank you.